In June last year, Sir Keir Starmer promised to end the use of asylum hotels, saving billions of pounds for the country in the process. Yet since that pledge was made by the now Prime Minister, 8,000 more asylum seekers are living out of hotels at taxpayers' expense than beforehand. My name's Tom Harwood and this is GBN Originals. The asylum scandal has been rocking the government, certainly with the amount of money spent, but also the disruption to communities. This is a high agenda item for this government and has pertinent electoral effects. So much so that the Labour candidate in the upcoming Runcorn by-election has changed her position, now saying she wants to see an end to asylum hotels, despite being of the welcome refugees position only a few months ago. Pertinent this issue is, and so what on earth is the government going to do about it? Well, the costs have been spiralling. Back in 2020, it cost around £17,000 to send a migrant to help them live in a hotel, to provide their stipend and all the rest of it. 5 years later, that has doubled the amount per migrant being spent. Now, when you think about the fact that there are even more migrants now in asylum hotels and we're spending more money per migrant, you can see how this spirals and spirals. Over £5 million a day is now being spent on asylum seekers in hotels while they wait for their assessments, indeed while they appeal any decisions. And this is a great cost for the British taxpayer. It's also a cost because what are these asylum seekers doing while they're in the hotels? Well, nothing. They're not allowed to work, although some do, of course, work in the black economy illegally. But other than that, they are staying in these hotels, being given money to live, being given room and board on the expense of the taxpayer, some even being given privileged access to healthcare so that they don't rub up against the native population in NHS clinics. And what else do they do? Loiter around town. Some have been pictured outside school gates. It's a problem, not just in terms of the money that is being spent, but also on the societal implications. A rational system, of course, would not have people languishing in hotels at taxpayers' expense. A rational system would have decisions made quickly, would have curtailment on appeal, and would have people either accepted as genuine refugees or detained and deported at speed. Yet we don't live in a rational system. People are living in what is supposed to be temporary accommodation for month after month and year after year. So it's clear why the Labour Party in the general election promised to end the use of asylum hotels, although clearly the number of people arriving by small boat has made that very difficult to do. Because we now have more and more people arriving by small boat. Indeed, 2025 up until today was the largest number of people arriving by small boat of any year on record. This despite the promise to smash the gangs. So where does this leave us now? Well, while there are tens of thousands of people in migrant hotels, there are actually more asylum seekers in private accommodation.
Us blokes hate talking about a little thinning up top, and many of us settle with that balding look, but that wasn't for me, and that's why I went to Elite Hair, the world's leading hair loss clinic, and now I've had over 4,000 new hairs added to this barnet, and very soon I'm going to be rocking some brand new flowing locks, and you can too. So how does it work? Step 1, I sent the team a set of photos of my head. Step 2, I then spoke to one of the Elite Hair staff who looked through my photo submissions and worked out a treatment plan for me. Step 3, Elite Hair then organised accommodation and the treatment. I was at their state-of-the-art treatment centre in Istanbul, and their incredibly kind staff took me through the process, and before I knew it, I was in surgery. Elite Hair and their leading medical experts have specialised in pain-free treatments using the sleep deep method, and they really mean that. I felt incredibly relaxed the whole time, and I haven't felt any pain since. Check out Elite Hair using the link in the description. When you do, Elite Hair will provide you with a free personalised hair analysis. Then you'll join over 100,000 happy patients. Hit that link and start your hair growth journey like I did today.
Yes, the numbers are stark. When you look at the over £5 million a day spent on hotels, there is actually an equal amount of money being spent on those who are living in other sorts of accommodation, of housing association type accommodation. And this is where the Office for Value for Money has stepped in. In a new report, they have suggested that it is a waste of money to be putting people in hotels. This report suggests that actually a more cost-effective way to deal with the situation would be to stop using hotels, phase that down, as indeed the government says they wish to do, and to move people into some of the 1.5 million new homes that the government promises to allow to be built over the course of this parliament. There are some problems, though, with this suggestion. Of course, the government have been promising to fix the housing crisis by building 1.5 million more homes by the end of this parliament. That's supposed to increase the supply, increase the competition, and therefore bring down housing costs, bring down rents relative to wages for all of us. Simple supply and demand. Yet when you increase the demand side of that equation too, you can see how the supply relative to demand gets smaller and smaller. If suddenly these 1.5 million new homes are being siphoned to use for asylum seekers rather than people trying to get onto the property ladder or looking for new places to live, well then the marginal net gain from those new houses is less, because there are more people trying to access them, and indeed people accessing them at taxpayer expense. This can clearly be a societal problem, a political problem, a problem of fairness. Ultimately, the fairest thing to do would to have these decisions, these asylum decisions, being made not just after a few weeks or a few months, or as now in some cases after a few years, but as soon as people arrive. Why is it that the government finds it so difficult to make a snap decision when someone arrives by small boat under the terms of the Nationality and Borders Act? People arriving by small boat are by definition illegal migrants. Why is it so difficult for the government to detain and deport? Well, one reason is that there aren't agreements with every country in terms of taking people back. It's easy enough to send an illegal migrant back to Albania because the United Kingdom signed an agreement with Albania. And that agreement led to the number of Albanians coming across the English Channel in small boats absolutely collapsing. Because if you have an agreement with a country from which a migrant comes, you can send them back very easily indeed. Where the problem comes is that we don't have an agreement with the Taliban. We don't have an agreement with Iran. We don't have an agreement with these states that have been taken over by terror groups. We don't have agreements with states that don't really have any infrastructure at all. The lack of diplomatic relations can often also be an issue. So what happens when someone arrives in this country and they come from one of those states where we can't send them back to, where we don't have those sort of international overarching agreements? Well, the previous government had an idea that popularly became known as Rwanda. Yes, a safe third country, not necessarily the country where the asylum seeker was coming from, but a country that has done a deal with the United Kingdom to accept people that we find difficult to deport back to their home country. And yet, one of the first things that the new government did was ditch this plan, ditch this deal. Now, of course, the courts have said there are plenty of problems with Rwanda as a country. I mean, it's not the most democratic country of the world, and yet it is a fast-growing and relatively stable African country. But here lies the problem of all international agreements when it comes to asylum. It's hard-pressed to find countries that are more stable, civilised and wealthy than the sort of country that the United Kingdom is. And so if we're going to make the bar that we can't send people back to a country that doesn't meet the level of human rights or the level of prosperity of the United Kingdom, well then the vast majority of the world by that metric would have the right to come and settle in the United Kingdom, and that is clearly absurd. When the United Kingdom signed up to the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees, it was a very different world. That convention, of course, says that people can come to a country and claim asylum in that country. It has a wide and expansive scope for claiming asylum. And yet it was written at a time when moving halfway around the world was an incredibly difficult thing to do, when inbuilt in the system was a sense of control, not because there was a necessary control of numbers by government, but a natural control. Simply because it was so difficult to travel halfway around the world. I mean, so expensive, so laborious to get from one place to another. One of the reasons why the international migrant crisis has grown and grown in recent years, despite, in actual fact, the amount of conflict in the world being substantially less this century than last century, is because the ease of travel has grown. And so it is much, much more easy for people coming from less economically developed areas, or even areas that do have conflict in them. It is far more easy for these individuals to travel halfway around the world, to travel thousands of miles to get to a country like the United Kingdom. And thereby the original safeguards, I suppose, that were thought to be in that 51 convention no longer exist. It is no longer extremely arduous to get from a less economically developed country, from a country that we might have previously considered to be a third world country, to a first world country. That is now not a difficult journey. And thereby the numbers have grown and grown and grown. And yet the United Kingdom stays signed up to the 51 Convention. Indeed, most countries around the world do. There are difficulties in reforming the 51 Convention, which many different governments have said would be necessary. Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary, gave a speech in the United States saying that this needs reform. But going back even further, it was Tony Blair's government that first raised the red flag over this issue, over the issue of the Convention, because of this greater ease of movement as this century began. And yet reform has not happened. And unilateral change to this treaty is almost impossible. Why? Because it's not just the UN Convention that governs the ability of people to claim asylum in the United Kingdom under that international law that we have ascribed to, but that is also the governing framework that allows the United Kingdom to deport people back to countries that have also signed up to that convention. To some extent, it is a two-way street, although clearly when countries fall into disrepair, when countries are taken over by terror groups, when countries become almost ungovernable, that framework breaks down. It's an incredibly complicated situation that the government clearly has not got a grip of. And that's one of the reasons why the third country deterrent idea, whether it be Rwanda, whether it be Costa Rica, as one suggestion made, or a whole host of different countries that the United Kingdom has an economic relationship with, whereby illegal migrants could be deported to for those that can't return to their home country, it seems strange now that the government has abandoned that model, that ability to break through the tricky impasse of international law that government after government in this country has found themselves stuck in. And so we are stuck in this situation. Once again, no deterrent, no safe third country which to send asylum seekers who fail their application, or indeed who come by irregular or illegal means to this country, people who come by small boat and whom we can't send back to their country of origin. We don't now have a safe third country to send them. So where do they go? Yes, we're back to the hotels. We're back to the millions of pounds a day, billions of pounds a year, to put people up in hotels to do nothing. This isn't good for the asylum seekers, both genuine and illegitimate. This isn't good for communities, and it certainly isn't good for the taxpayer. So what the Office for Value for Money has suggested could well save money. It is, in fact, cheaper to keep people in private housing than it is keeping people in hotels. But it still costs money. It's still a sticking plaster solution. It still doesn't get to the fundamental issue of this problem, which is there are people in the United Kingdom with no right to be in the United Kingdom, living here at taxpayer expense. Clearly, the government has got a long way to go if they want to solve this issue, if they want to save this money. And going half measures, shifting asylum seekers from majoritarily being in hotels to being majoritarily in private accommodation, in new build housing. It might save money in the short run, but it doesn't solve the problem. And indeed, it could have cascading issues further down the line. It could make this ability to bring down the cost of private rented accommodation for everyone else in the country that much harder. Clearly, there is much more to look at in this area. There is much more for the government to examine, and frankly, in some areas, much more to go back to the drawing board with. But I'll leave you with this thought. If the government can get to the end of this parliament saying, we've ended the scandal of hotels, we've ended the asylum seeker hotel issue, would that be a political win, even if it might be a sleight of hand? What if the government simply moved everyone from hotels into purpose-built accommodation, into even accommodation that wasn't purpose-built, multi-occupancy housing, for example? What if there was just a bait and switch, the same number of people similarly living off taxpayers' expense, but in homes rather than hotels? Would you buy that bait and switch? Perhaps the government expects you to. Well, we'll keep a close eye on it here at GB News, and remember to stay subscribed to the GBN YouTube channel for much more on this issue. It's one that certainly won't be going away.